The Vietnam War of 1955 to 1975 was infamous for one thing. It was fought between the wars in which the American forces were not prepared for. The war was fought between South Vietnam, supported by the US, and North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China. While the Army of the North could not stand against the US-backed South in terms of skill and firepower, they made up for it with their ability to hamper the progress of the Americans. One way they did this was to use booby traps, deadly ones that continue to haunt the memories of those that fought in the war. From the infamous punji stick to snake pits, here are some of the most terrifying booby traps used in the Vietnam War. Welcome to Unveiled History. Beginning in the mid-19th century, Vietnam was under the control of France as part of French Indochina. Under French rule, Vietnamese nationalism was suppressed. However, a series of events starting from the invasion of French Indochina by Japan led to the First Indochina War in 1946. The French Union was eventually defeated and Vietnam gained independence at the 1954 Geneva Conference. However, Vietnam was divided into two parts at the 17th parallel, North and South, with promises of a nationwide election in 1956 that would reunify both sides. At the time, Northern Vietnam had strong ties with Communist China and the Soviet Union, while the South had strong ties with the West. In 1955, the US supported a coup that made a strong anti-communist politician, Ngo Diem, president of South Vietnam. With the help of the US military and the CIA, Diem's security forces cracked down on sympathizers of the North in the South, who he called the Viet Cong, meaning Vietnamese communist. Diem arrested about 100,000 people, many of whom were tortured and executed. In 1957, the Viet Cong and those who opposed Diem's oppressive regime began to fight back. They were supported by the Army of the North, which supplied them with forces and direction. By 1959, the conflict had escalated into a full-blown war. By 1962, the US military presence in South Vietnam had increased to about 9,000 troops. However, after the death of Diem in 1963, the US military presence further increased. By June 1965, the number of US troops had increased to 85,000. The following month, US President Lyndon Johnson dispatched an additional 100,000 troops and another 100,000 in 1966. But despite the US air supremacy, firepower and the number of forces, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces refused to back down. They took advantage of the fact that the war was on their home turf and created deadly booby traps. These traps were not only cost effective, but many of them didn't register on the mine detectors used by the US. The goal of these traps was not to kill, but to maim, thereby slowing the progress of the US forces. According to reports, about 11% of deaths and 17% of US troops wounded between 1968 to 1970 were as a result of these deadly traps. These traps did not just physically affect the American soldiers, but also psychologically affected them, thereby reducing their morale. Punji sticks were one of the common booby traps used by the Viet Cong. The sticks were made from sharpened bamboo, or in some cases metal, and coated in feces, urine, or other poisonous substances from animals and plants. The purpose of this trap was to cause infection in the victim. After preparing the sticks, the Viet Cong would dig a hole and place the sticks at the bottom, pointing upright. Then, the hole would be covered with a thin frame to camouflage the sticks. An unsuspecting US soldier would break through the flimsy cover over the hole and step onto the spikes, resulting in injuries to his feet and legs. But this trap could even be made worse in two ways. The first way was by installing the sticks at a downward angle along the sides of the holes. This meant that it would become extremely difficult for the soldier to get out of the hole without causing further injury to himself. The second way was to dig another hole next to the hole filled with punji sticks. The purpose of this hole was to trap any soldier who attempts to rescue his injured comrade. According to reports, punji sticks accounted for 2% of wounds to American soldiers. As the name sounds, snake pits were simply pits filled with venomous snakes. These pits were used within the Viet Cong's tunnel systems. The tunnel systems were dug by the Viet Cong for several purposes, including shelter and support networks. The tunnels were vast, stretched for miles, and contained hospitals, ammunition and equipment stores, living areas, fighting positions, and headquarters. Due to its importance to the Viet Cong, the US forces made it a necessity to clear them. Often it was done by a special US force known as the Tunnel Rats, but these Tunnel Rats were in for a surprise. Inside the tunnels, the Tunnel Rats encountered the snake pits, which came in several forms. In some cases, the Viet Cong would tie poisonous snakes, often a bamboo pit viper, to bamboo sticks and place them in different parts of the tunnels. The bamboo sticks would then be released by tripwires, and when that happens, so would the snake, which would bite the victim. Within a few minutes, the flesh becomes necrotic, swollen, and extremely painful. In some other cases, the Viet Cong would often carry bags filled with the bamboo pit vipers. These vipers would then attack anyone who searches through them. The US tunnel rats had to be specially trained to disarm the snake pits. Grenade in a can was constructed by placing a grenade with the safety pin removed into a can. The can holds down the strike lever. A tripwire is then attached to the can. When it is tripped by a soldier, a tripwire pulls the explosive out of the can and causes it to detonate. It was usually placed along tunnel bases awaiting the tunnel rats or in a stream. This booby trap was either constructed with a single can and a stake, or with two cans. If two cans were used, they would be placed on trees either side of the path, connected by the tripwire. The North Vietnam Army and the Viet Cong loved to fly flags. However, they knew that American troops loved to capture the flags of their enemies and other war trophies after a defeat. So, they decided to take advantage of this knowledge and create booby traps on captured flags and war trophies. So, whenever the Viet Cong were forced from their bases, they would rig their flags with explosives before they left. When the US troops tried to take down the flags, the explosives would immediately detonate. But it wasn't just flags. The Viet Cong also rigged anything that would be considered a war trophy by the American forces. The explosives in these items would also detonate if taken by the American troops. The Viet Cong also frequently used secondary booby traps which would go off as soldiers rushed to help injured colleagues, thereby causing additional casualties. Like punji sticks, the cartridge trap was placed in a hole in the ground and was very difficult to detect. This trap involved placing an ammunition round inside a tube made from bamboo. A nail and a wooden board would then be placed underneath it to act as a mock fire pin. Finally, the hole would be covered with camouflage to prevent the American troops from detecting it. When the unsuspecting soldier steps into the hole, the weight of the soldier activates the ammunition and fires it through the feet. The extent of the injury depended on the size of the shell. Smaller shells led to permanent disability, while larger ones could lead to death. The cartridge trap earned the name toe poppers. The purpose of this trap was to create an opportunity for the Viet Cong to ambush while the injured soldier was being treated. The bamboo whip was another deadly trap used by the Viet Cong. The whip was made by attaching foot-long spikes over a long bamboo pole. The pole is then attached to a tripwire and pulled back into an arc with a lot of tension. When the wire is tripped, the bamboo pole whips back into a straight position and impales the soldier who triggered the tripwire. According to reports, the poles could travel up to 100 miles an hour. Sometimes the spikes on the poles would be covered with poisonous substances which would hamper the healing process of the victim. The mace has got to be the worst of all booby traps faced by the American soldiers. It operated in a similar fashion to the bamboo whips. But instead of long bamboo poles, the spikes were attached to a 24-inch clay, wooden or metal ball. The ball usually weighed 40 pounds and was triggered by a tripwire. Once it is triggered, the hidden ball would swing down using its force of gravity and inflict terrible wounds to the head or upper torso of the soldier. This trap usually resulted in the death of the soldier. The tiger trap worked similarly to the mace, but instead of a swinging bull, the trap consisted of a man-sized plank weighted with bricks and full of metal spikes. The trap is triggered by a tripwire which would cause severe injury to the head of the victim. Although the Viet Cong suffered defeats at the hands of the US troops, the injuries, death and mental torture inflicted on American troops from the deadly booby traps would forever remain in the minds of American soldiers who survived the war. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, drop a comment and subscribe to our channel if this is your first time here.